celebrates the National Labor Union. They're replaced, incidentally, by the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. The KOLs are often called the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor is interesting because it's open by their own admission to what they call any producer, as opposed to parasites. Right? So there's two kinds of people in the economy. There's the producer, the worker, and the parasite who like makes money off of the worker and exploits them. It's very, very sort of a socialist kind of a language, right? And actually businesses that are owned by business owners that are friendly to workers, like bars or laundry mats or things like that, often would buy a membership in the Knights of Labor and put a sign up that said this business is operated by a friend of labor. So you can come in here and buy beer at my saloon because I'm sort of sympathetic to the working man, right? And so, inevitably, it didn't work out. There was never really an effective way to organize sort of all the workers into a union, because that would be the idea, right? If every worker is in the union, then when we strike, it's not a strike, it's what they call a general strike. Everybody in the entire economy walks off the job, right? There's nobody picking up garbage, waiting tables, cleaning sheets, folding towels, operating the steel mill, driving the cars or the trains, the trucks or the taxis. And so the idea would be a general strike would be when the workers could just shut the economy down. And they could say, who's really in charge of this, us or you, right? That's always the goal, but it never works because you can never really get everybody unified together. Right? You can never get all the workers to sort of be on the same page in that way, right? And so having said that, we've got to talk then about some of the more specific and kind of well-known strikes, right? The first one we can mention is an event that's often known as the Haymarket Riot. Riot is like a misleading term, but it is what it is, right? It takes place on May 4th, 1886, and so it takes place in Chicago. The Haymarket is a square in Chicago. It's on the west side of Chicago, and in the early 1800s, they had actually sold hay in the square. There had been a farmer's market there, which is where it gets the term Haymarket. You still go to Haymarket today. It's a big traffic plaza today. There's one little tiny plaque that was put up a few years ago to commemorate these events, which is if you don't know what you're looking for, there's not like a statue or anything, right? So, all spring long, there has been labor unrest in Chicago. Temperatures are high, tempers are high as well. There is a big business in Chicago called the Cyrus McCormick Mechanical Reaper Factory. Cyrus McCormick was born in the 18th century, lived in the 19th century guy. He invented mechanical reapers. Mechanical reapers are farm equipment that can cut wheat in an automated way. If you've ever seen a horror movie that's on a farm and there's the giant sticky blade tractor thingy that somebody falls and gets sucked into, that's a mechanical reaper. It looks like a giant lawnmower. And so prior to this, if you cut wheat, you do it with a scythe. It's backbreaking, time-consuming. The mechanical reaper, you get a horse to pull it down a field, and it just cuts the wheat up into the sheaves and just sort of bundles it off to the side, and you can just follow along and tie it up, throw it in a wagon. These days, mechanical reapers even have tractor engines. You drive them like cars, right? And so Cyrus McCormick invented these. Made a lot of money. By the late 19th century, his business is failing. He's losing out on patents to various European countries that have come up with better versions of the mechanical reaper. His sales are declining. So there's a lockout in progress, right? In the spring of 1873, 1886 when this takes place, 1886, he's initiated a lockout, and he's locked out all the workers and said nobody goes back to work until everybody signs a contract taking like a 10% wage cut, right? Until we get wage cuts across the board. And workers begin protesting outside of his factory. The Chicago Police Department breaks up the protest and shoots and kills a number of workers. The Chicago Police Department is regarded as being basically a bought and paid for goon squad operated by the big businesses in Chicago. It's not seen as being the police, it's seen as being the sort of strike-breaker arm of the city government. Yeah.
It was called the McCormick?
Yes, Cyrus McCormick.
Cyrus
it's this
McCormick.
guy who built a factory, invented mechanical reapers. Yeah. So the day after the shooting, these signs go up all over Chicago. Attention working men, a great mass meeting will be tonight at 7:30 o'clock at Haymarket between Randolph and Des Plaines and Homestead. Good speakers will be present to denounce the latest atrocious act of the police, the shooting of our fellow workmen yesterday afternoon. And because of the multi-ethnic character Chicago, they print it in German, right? Achtung Arbeiter, eine große Masseversammlung, heute Abend halb 8 Uhr auf dem Haymarkt, right? So it's in German. So the German-speaking workers can come too, right? And so the whole thing is organized by a bunch of sort of labor union activists in the city, and they get together and they start having big speeches in Haymarket that evening, right? And so you can see this is the events of the evening compressed into a single picture in Harper's Illustrated Weekly magazine. What happens is this guy, Albert Parsons, is speaking at one end of the Haymarket on a flipped over wagon. Parsons is an interesting guy. He's a pacifist. He moved into the South as a young man. He married an African-American woman and brought her back up north to him, to Chicago, where she lived with him as his wife, which was unusual in those days. Unusual beyond belief in the South, still very unusual in the North to be in a mixed-race marriage. Parsons is actually giving a speech denouncing the use of violence. He says, if we kill police officers, we're just murderers, right? We're just as bad as them. And also, if you kill police officers, it gives the police the ability to just arrest us and ignore our wider concerns, right? I mean, then you're just a murderer, right? So he's urging the workers, we can't engage in violence. We've got to be peaceful. We've got to stick together. In the middle of his speech, a bomb goes off. In the middle of a crowd of police officers waiting on the side of the Haymarket. Someone in the crowd lit the fuse and threw the bomb. No one is ever able to determine who it was. The bomb goes off and injures about 12 police officers. The police officers pull out billy clubs and pistols and begin firing into the crowd, and they charge into the crowd and begin beating the workers. None of the workers fire back, despite the fact that this picture, which appeared in the newspaper, depicts a worker holding a pistol. Right? So there is a bloody and awful confrontation in the Haymarket. Dozens and dozens of people are killed or injured, and it spreads all over the streets of Chicago. Pretty soon it gets contained. The police bring in squads of police officers and clear the streets and make some arrests and whatever. But the city government, at the behest of the managers of the companies, they argue that something has to be done. Right? The city government is under heavy pressure to get somebody for this. Well, of course, the obvious suspect is the guy who threw the bomb. Right? I mean, that's the obvious suspect that we're going to get. Who is that person? God only knows. And in fact, to this day, no one knows who it is. Right? And so, having said that, instead, suspicion falls on the guys that organized the whole thing. And you can see this is a sympathetic picture, and then another just from a newspaper. These are the organizers of the Haymarket sort of rally, right? You've got here, they're called the Anarchists of Chicago, and then this is just pictures of them, right? And you can see there's Parsons right there. And some of these guys are a little bit scary. I want to say it's Schwab, Spies, and Nieba are actually from Germany. And I want to say it was Oscar Nieba, who he's not on this one, I don't think. Nieba actually had been shot in the face by German police officers during a labor protest in Berlin, and the bullet actually went in his cheek and came out the other side. So he's got this horrible disfiguring scar that he grew the beard to cover. And so, I mean, he's like a really scary character, doesn't even speak English. And so he's like the stereotype of like the terrifying immigrant, anarchist, terrorist guy, right? If you needed one. And so the police arrest these guys, and they put them on trial in the summer of 1886, right? And so there's just a problem. Is Parsons guilty of throwing the bomb? Well, by definition, he can't be, because he was at one end of Haymarket giving a speech about nonviolence while the bomb got thrown off, right? I mean, it's like, how could you be guilty of doing that? He can't be in two places at the same time, quite literally, right? So the prosecutors instruct the jury that during the course of the trial, if it can be proven by a reasonable person's standard that anything these men said or wrote might have inspired somebody to go use violence against the police officers, then they should be as guilty as the guy who threw the bomb himself, right?
He was denouncing violence.
That's correct.
So,
but even then, well, I mean, if he said something that might make someone who's predisposed to violence want to use violence, then I guess he would be guilty also. But that's a very difficult standard to even link the rhetoric of a pacifist to a murderer, right?
They were going to find him guilty anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point here, is that the point is not to have a trial, the point is to have us have a legal proceeding so we give an excuse to get these guys. Pretty much.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to hang, might as well be these guys, right? And by the way, if you hang them, at least there's 7 less anarchists, right? And so, by that standard, I mean, it's an almost impossible, insane legal standard to write, right? You can't ask the bomber if he might not even have known who these guys are. We don't know. He might never even read anything they wrote. He might be, he might have been a police agent provocateur, aiming to make the movement look bad. But of course, the lawyers for these guys argue repeatedly that their First Amendment rights guarantee them the right to free speech, and if somebody wants to commit violence in their name, they're not really responsible. Those are sort of rejected, right? Those arguments are rejected. And the trial itself becomes this kind of ridiculous, sort of farcical scenario. They're in this big courthouse in downtown Chicago. It's incredibly hot in the summer. If they open the windows, a huge crowd has gathered outside, and kids are climbing up on the windows, holding onto the windowsills, shouting repeatedly repeating whatever's said in the courtroom. So there's this like gallery of people oohing and awing and cheering and screaming every time something exciting is said. So the judge will periodically close the windows because it's distracting, but then the courtroom gets to be like 120 degrees. So they open the windows and then it gets loud again, right? And my favorite and most creepy story about all this is when the judge himself actually sleeps through some of the proceedings, which gives you is not, if you're one of these guys on trial for murder, that's like not what you want to see. But even weirder, he has a big candy jar on his the bench that he's using, and what he does is he periodically will write a note, give it to one of the bailiffs, and the bailiff will go find an attractive young girl in the crowd and give her the note. Yeah, she already exactly as creepy as you thought. And the note would say, like, do you want to come sit up behind the bench and like watch the proceedings? And of course, you're like, yeah, that's great. And so you get escorted up the bench and you sit next to the judge. It's like, oh, you want some candy? And so the judge is sitting behind the bench, like flirting with girls from the crowd during a capital murder trial. Yeah, it's a little bizarre. And in the end, what a surprise, these guys are convicted. Several of them get the death penalty, several of them get life in prison, a couple of the death penalties are commuted. They execute Spies and Parsons, specifically. And Spies is scary to the end when they put the noose around and they say everything else to say. And he says in German, if you kill me, it's not going to change anything. There's going to just be somebody else exactly like me who's going to come and do something worse. Which is sort of like, prove if you needed any that this guy's a monster, right? At least according to their standards. Parsons himself goes to his death and is buried in one of Chicago's big cemeteries. His wife organizes a thing, they collect a bunch of money and build him a monument. And so the city government of Chicago pretty much covers up the whole thing. For a long time, socialists and labor movement activists from Europe would come on May 4th expecting there to be like parades and stuff, and there were none. There were no monuments, and it wasn't until like the 1980s that the city government put up a little tiny plaque just commemorating this happened in 1886 or whatever. And so everybody who watches this trial in the newspapers, I mean, it's all over the press in the United States, agrees that it's a bullshit proceeding, right? I mean, you don't have to be sympathetic to the labor movement to think that maybe some innocent people are getting executed. The governor of Illinois, John Altgeld, is petitioned by numerous people for a pardon. If there's ever a time to give someone a pardon, it's these guys. And Altgeld says to an aide, I would love to pardon them, but I have to run for re-election in this state. And I would not win were I to pardon these guys. They're so unpopular. And so that, as they say, is that, right? So the next one we can mention is Homestead. Homestead is a little bit later and is in Pennsylvania. Homestead is a small town in Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, that has a steel mill owned by a small company. And Andrew Carnegie buys the company, and he intends to integrate it into his business, right? And one of the things that Carnegie does is that he spends a lot of time and effort constantly upgrading the steel mills so they've got the latest machinery, they're the most efficient they can be, and that means frequent off time at the factories, right? And so Carnegie has also heard rumors that there is a union forming in the Homestead factory. So he sends one of his business partners, Henry Clay Frick. He says to Frick, go to Homestead and smoke out the union, right? See if you can get them to sort of reveal themselves and then break the union. So by the time we've installed the new machinery, the factory will be up and running and it'll be union free, right? And so the confrontation happens in 1892. Frick announces wage cuts and layoffs at the factory, and the union predictably begins to protest, right? And so when the workers begin to strike outside the factory, Frick calls in strikebreakers, and actually there was a big fight outside of the Homestead factory. And so you can see here the Homestead steel workers have actually constructed barricades out of steel. They turn a steel foundry into a makeshift cannon to intimidate the strikebreakers, and they end up seizing the factory and kind of holding themselves up inside. And so what happens is that Frick goes to the state of Pennsylvania. He goes to the governor of Pennsylvania, and he says, you gotta help me. I've got these workers, they've seized my property, they're holed up in the factory, they're gonna attack us or something. So the governor of Pennsylvania agrees to send in the Pennsylvania National Guard to do something. And the National Guard comes in by boat. And when they come in, they're met at the docks by the families of the striking workers. And the families of the striking workers approach these guys and say, look, you're the Pennsylvania National Guard, you're from around here, right? Like you're from this place. Are you really gonna get guns and go march up to those workers who are probably your friends and neighbors and fellow parishioners in your church, and you're gonna shoot people that you know? And by the way, we all know who you are, so if you do that, like, don't expect there to be no consequences. Like, don't expect to go to any restaurant in the town ever again.